Hello, and welcome to the next talk in the 2021 set of OpenUK's Future Leader training sessions. Please note this meeting is being recorded and will be made available soon afterwards on our YouTube channel. First, a little about the OpenUK Future Leaders Group. The Future Leaders Group is a collection of individuals who are interested in open technologies, including open source software, open hardware, and open data. It includes a wide range of people that work in technology, intellectual property, outsourcing, procurement, data, coding and innovation, as well as private practice lawyers and in-house counsel that work in the technology sector and related fields. It operates under the direction of the OpenUK Legal and Policy Committee and has a clear purpose to bring together and develop future leaders in legal and policy matters relating to open technologies and to support and further the mission of the Legal and Policy Committee. The Future Leaders Group is currently co-chaired by me, Robert Brunels from Phil Fisher, and Katie Gibson from Bristow's, and we're both lawyers advising on technology and commercial matters. The group is always open to new ideas and to new members, whether getting involved in all of our activities or just dipping in and out of our various projects, so please do get in contact if you'd like to get involved. And for today's session, we're pleased to be joined by Amanda Brock, OpenUK's very own CEO. Now, Amanda needs no introduction, but for those not familiar, alongside Amanda's work as CEO of OpenUK, covering the three opens of open source software, open hardware and open data, she's also the European representative of the world's biggest defensive patent pool, the Open Invention Network. OASIS is Open Projects Advisory Council member on open source and open standards, an advisory board member of KDE, and a member of various commercial and startup advisory boards, including Mimoto, as well as mentoring several C-suite individuals. Amanda is also the editor of the book Free and Open Source Software, Law and Policy in Practice, second edition, to be published by the Oxford University Press in the summer of this year, with open access sponsored by the Weizsäcker Foundation and contributed to by 20 leading figures in open source. As usual, we'll have a chance for any questions at the end, so please pop them in the chat and we'll invite you onto voice and video to ask them yourself if you'd like to. Amanda, welcome to our session today and thanks for joining us, and over to you to talk about OpenUK State of Open Phases 1 and 2.
Thanks very much, Rob. And I'm going to start just by giving a slightly more detailed introduction to myself and what I do. So as Rob said, as well as being CEO of OpenUK, I have since 2008 been involved with OIN. I took Canonical into OIN as a board funder, and I represented Canonical as an associate member on the board. So I spent a few years doing that, and since I left Canonical at the beginning of 2013, I have worked as a European rep, and OIN is very close to my heart. So if you've got any questions about that, please do follow up with me afterwards. Rob mentioned the book that will be out. Actually, it won't be this summer, it will be late this year. It's the one and only time this book will have my name as the sole editor on the front cover, because editing over 20 other people's work was a lot harder than I expected and frankly very time consuming. So I'm pleased that we're able, with the Veach Foundation's help, to make this open access. It will be a tool for communities, it will be a tool for legal teams, it will be an educational tool and form a lot of the tertiary education curriculum for the non-coding aspects of open source. Now, that should, I think, be out October, November. But my life is, as Rob says, made up of the work I do in OpenUK and OIN, writing, speaking. And I spend a lot of time, this is from All Things Open in 2019, I spend a lot of time in the old world, traveling in the new worlds, talking to a screen with my little cat, Dundee, who is also very knowledgeable about open source, I'll have you know. I spend a lot of time speaking and sharing messaging and information about open source software as we see different activities and impacts on it. And I also, as Rob said, sit on a number of advisory boards. I did chair until the beginning of this year the United Nations Open Source and IP Advisory Board for their innovation labs. The labs have closed, so unfortunately that role ended, but we are looking at how and where we might be able to have good impact. And how I got into this space is that in early 2008, I joined Canonical, which was a relatively young startup, and I joined as their first lawyer. Didn't know much about open source and thought I did, but very rapidly learned that it was going to be a huge learning curve. And I think, 13 and a half years later, every day I'm learning something new and expanding my knowledge, which is great, because what we see today is that open source underpins society. As we've digitalized, we see a transition into a digital economy where businesses are based on digital infrastructure and digital public services, digital public sector, and ultimately digital government, all of which relies heavily on infrastructure. And of course, infrastructure is one of the things that we see the UK being wonderful at. We have a very strong presence here. So my learning in Canonical went on for 5 years, where I really did nothing but open source software day in, day out, and a job I loved. And Canonical, for those who don't know, it is the commercial sponsor of Ubuntu. These days it has a much broader portfolio and remit, but that's where it was when I was there. And I went through quite an interesting period being there. So we went from a company that was very much like Red Hat, focused on on-prem, focused on the desktop in Canonical's case. And we were very much the operating system of choice for the development community. And we sort of shifted in that time. And Simon Wardley, who will be doing some training on the 29th of July for OpenUK, the creator of Wardley Maps, great process for understanding what you're trying to achieve and mapping it out. Simon was the cloud director at OpenUK at the time, at Canonical at the time, and there's a lot of learning came through Canonical at that period of time. We went up to about 600 employees globally, primarily working from home, but of course some working in the London office where we were a couple of hundred people. And a lot of the really knowledgeable people from open source passed through Canonical in those years that I was there, Simon being one of them. And Simon is instrumental in having taken Canonical's cloud positioning from almost nothing to over 70% almost overnight. And Ubuntu became the go-to OS instance in the cloud environment and still very much is today. So in December 2019, I joined OpenUK. It was a relatively new organization and was very embryonic. And I brought on board our board, who have been now in situ for 18 months. They will, half of them stand down at the end of the year. Some will stand for re-election, and then half the following year. And we'll see cyclical 2-year terms on the board. But the board came up with this vision in January 2020. We'll be revisiting that this month at our board strategy meeting. But our vision is to develop and sustain UK leadership in open technology. And that makes a lot of sense. We shifted. We're different from any other geographical organization and from many of the non-geographical organizations in that we recognized and shifted from this open source software specific environment to understanding open technology. And for us, we decided open technology is open source software, hardware, and data. And if you look behind me, you'll see the words open in UK are split by 3 dots. Those dots represent open source software, hardware, and data, the open technology that we talk about. Now, my personal firm belief is that we will see a shift over time and that all open source organizations will embrace the other 2 opens. And they'll do that because in 2020s, the roaring 20s, such as they've been for all of us so far, you cannot have an organization about software without thinking about data. And actually, you ought to be thinking about hardware too. And we see hardware and software becoming harder to differentiate in some spaces. So that data conversation is very important as well. So we expanded out. And I hope we'll see more of the open source organizations do the same. I very much expect we will, although I don't know how quickly. And then the second thing about OpenUK is we are about 3 pillars, and our circle in our logo represents these 3 pillars. And those are community, legal and policy, and learning. Now, I've randomly picked 3. We've never allotted colors. Maybe we should. And the community piece is interesting. The community piece is about bringing together this community within the UK. And I'm telling you all of this because it's relevant to the report. I'm not just waffling on here. If you look at community, the UK is actually the biggest community of open source contributors by number of engineers, developers, and by lines of code across Europe. It's probably 5th biggest in the world. All the different things that we can see show it as 5th. And that's coming behind China, behind India, behind the US, significantly larger markets, right? So we're 62 billion, something like that in the UK. You're looking at countries that are tens of our size who are ahead of us, unsurprisingly, but you're looking at many countries who are bigger or the same size who are way behind us. So we really have a position as a centre of excellence. And that's something that hasn't been particularly acknowledged or recognised in the UK. And it hasn't been particularly recognised or acknowledged because we haven't talked we haven't made a fuss about it. We haven't shouted it from the rooftops. We haven't celebrated. And one of the things that we saw in our phase 1 report that I will come back to in a moment is that the contribution from open source software to the UK's economy is up to 43.1 billion per annum. Now, I don't believe that. It's my report. I led the report and I don't believe it. I believe it's at least double that. The reason I believe it's at least double that is figures that I've seen that I can't use around number of developers. And what we had to use, because it's what was available in the marketplace and public, are figures that show the UK with all the incremental calculations in 2020 sitting at 126,000 developers. It's nearer 200,000, but if we use that 126,000, we get to 43.1 billion, up to 43.1 billion. If you were to multiply that up to the 200, you suddenly double it. Now that's interesting and important. I joined calls with the digital minister on behalf of Open UK now, and on those calls, the AI community was celebrating their contribution to GDP, which on paper is bigger, it's 48 billion. But actually, or up to 48 billion. Actually, if you go back to my suggestion that our figures are what we're able to use and way too low, then it would imply that open is worth much more to the UK's economy than AI. And that's a really interesting proposition. And then if we take a step back also and think about AI, of course, AI is built on open. So how do we quantify that too? Interesting stuff. So this community in the UK is critical. It's critical because post-Brexit, we see the UK as a centre of excellence in open. And we see that centre of excellence not so much in the companies that are being founded and scaling in the UK as in the people. And if you look at our phase 2 report and Starling Bank's case study, Steve Newson from Starling Bank says, I know lawyers amongst you, technically he's wrong, but he says the IP isn't in the code, the IP is in the people. And open is all about code, but it's also about people and collaboration, because that code only comes from people and the usage comes from people. And the know-how and the knowledge and the skills and the ability to manage the collaboration around it all comes from people. So the people are essential to open source. What you have is basically your code and your people. That's the same now for all software, which is the same for all digital environments, and effectively it's the same for businesses. I can remember personally in 2000 working in an ISP, and we were the first big IPO in the .com era in Europe, FreeServe. And in that, what we saw was Dixon's, the retailers, owned FreeServe, and overnight Dixon's, which was a team of 12 of us with no tangible assets, became worth more than Dixon's Group, which employed 40,000 people, had 1,000 stores. And I can remember the company secretary there sort of shaking his head to me and saying, this just doesn't make sense. And that was obviously over 20 years ago. Now we accept that valuation is common. And that's where we get to with software and a software-enabled society, but acknowledging that open source underlies most of that software today is something we see generally and something that I've been trying to lead from the UK. So going back to my community here, what we have is a community of engineers, a community of developers, community of people around that, the business people, the marketeers, the lawyers, the COOs, the finance people, the HR people, all the people who build expertise in open source software. Now, of course, I've said we're about the 3 open software hardware data. 2021's report, State of Open, is purely focused on software. Next year, we will do a follow-up, and it will probably be a single report with a single survey comparing to this year, which will be really interesting. And we'll have broadened our reach and people's understanding of us, so hopefully we will have a much bigger survey than the 273 respondents this year. I also hope that we will expand to have 3 reports again, but one will be hardware, one will be data, and one will be software, and that will be a learning. But going back to the people, this community of a couple of 100,000 people just around the software is what we want to bring together. And that's one of the key differentiators between us and the other industry organizations that are geographic. They tend to represent the startups or the scale-ups in country, which are built on open source software. They become industry member organizations. Now, what we've seen in the UK is that a lot of our companies get founded and sold. Companies like Datadog are based on software developed by a UK engineer, scaled to a certain size and then sold. And we have an incredible engineering talent in the UK who have built lots of base point organizations that have then had others build on them. And if you haven't seen, we have an entrepreneur in residence. That's a 6-month revolving role. Matt Barker is in it until the end of the year. He's leading a founders forum who are doing a lot of work on that. And I'm going to talk to you a bit more about that in a second. So we bring together this community, and I'm taking time to explain it because it's important. The community in the UK, the business community around Open in the UK, is several 100,000 people. It is made up of people working in non-technology companies, and it is made up of people working in non-UK owned businesses. And a huge number of our people are in those. And that's for multiple reasons. One is obviously language compatibility with the US, which is one of the biggest markets historically. One is that we have great engineers, and the engineering skills from the UK mean that it's one of the first countries that people look to when they want to expand their businesses. So we've seen this evolution, particularly in the last decade in the UK, and often people don't even acknowledge or realise that they're working in open source, but we have this massive community. And we celebrate those and try to bring them together to create a cohesive and single voice, because when you pull those people together, you can have impact. And the impact we have is through legal and policy and education, but we'll stick to legal and policy, our second pillar. There is a legal group which has spawned the Future Leaders Group. This year, the Future Leaders Group, in our first year of existence, has very much focused on legal and policy. They did a wonderful report on the government procurement terms, which has been submitted into the Cabinet Office. This group is going to expand as we get into the autumn, and you will see more and more developers, founders, business people joining it. I expect that it will get much, much bigger quite quickly, and part of that will be down to our Founders Forum work, which I'll come back to. So as it stands today, our legal group respond to all UK legislation and consultations which relate to anything to do with open. And I've come off a call with a group of them this morning, and that group have been discussing security. And we've got, sitting in a group of half dozen, a couple of them are in-house, a couple of them are private practice. One was a policy person and myself. And we've got deep expertise in a lot of these different technology and technology law areas that we can bring to the fore. We will be producing a blog shortly showing how the legal group's response to the data strategy is actually quoted at different points in the data strategy the UK has produced. So we use that legal group. We don't just respond to UK, we respond to Europe and on occasion to the US. We were, I believe, the only non-US organization to put an amicus brief into Google v Oracle, which we did with a number of other open source companies. And then we also put together a response to the Biden order in May on security and software bills and materials. So it's really important. Now, we were acknowledged by the European Commission within months of the group being formed as the go-to place in the UK. We're the strategic player for open technology, software, hardware and data on an open basis in the UK. We also do a lot of policy work that goes beyond just the legal responses, and we have different policy groups with things like Gaia X and looking at sustainability. And I'll come back to sustainability later in the conversation. The third pillar, of course, is learning, and we ran a summer camp last year. This year we will be doing a similar, but it will be run in school time. We found a lot of the groups actually run in school, where they're led by community leaders and teachers. So we will be giving away 5,000 glove kits this year, and we'll be doing that in September, and then running our camp through the schools in the autumn term. And I'm hoping that we will see that expand. And what we're doing is we're looking at teaching open in the secondary education system. When we regroup after the summer vacation in September, our tertiary education group will be doing a lot more. You can see some of what's happening in tertiary education in the State of Open case studies. There are also videos on openuk.uk/stateofopen which show you a lot of that from the Turing Institute, from Swansea University and Edinburgh University. And the kids competition has already been recognised in the GNOME Community Challenge, where it was the runner-up, but I expect that it will also be recognised in more awards in the next year. So getting onto the report proper, what you're here for. We launched State of Open Phase 1 back in March, having come up with the concept in January. And what we've done is a rapid go-to-market on these reports, which is why we split it into 3 phases. So Phase 1 looked at the UK in 2021, and it looked at our contribution and our place in the open source software market. Phase 2 looks at adoption within the UK, and Phase 3 is going to take some of the criticisms I've made of my own report, or our own report, into a new space where it looks at how can we value the value generated from open source as opposed to the lines of code and number of developers in. And that valuation will be both economic, and it will be in some of the hard to measure intangibles, things like sustainability, security, skills development and collaboration. And you can find Phase 1 and 2 at openuk.uk/stateofopen. We progressed from Phase 1 and we did a survey. The survey went out to the world at large, had to be based in the UK to do it, didn't matter if you were UK owned or not. We pushed it out through some magazines. The BCS kindly shared it with their fellows for us. We pushed it out on social media. Obviously, there's a bias in terms of who's interested enough to respond. I think 48% were tech companies, 52% were non-tech, which is quite important. I'd like to see that non-tech increase next year. We asked a number of questions which any CIO or CTO would be able to answer. And the findings of that were shared in State of Open Phase 2 on Wednesday, the 7th of July. Now, Rob, do I stop sharing here for you to be able to, or can you just pop in with the video?
I'll then share the video, yeah.
Thank you for joining us today to discuss OpenUK's second phase of its report, State of Open, the UK in 2021. I'm Amanda Brock, I'm CEO and Chief Policy Officer at OpenUK. Back in January, I was interviewed for another report as a subject matter expert on open source software. When I got talking to the interviewer and talking about the UK, I realised that after a year as CEO of OpenUK, the importance and value of the open source business community in the UK was something that needed to be delved into further and that we needed to share. In Phase 1, the headline was very definitely that the UK is #1 in Europe, something pre-Brexit we hadn't really looked at. We also saw up to 43.1 billion of contribution to UK GDP per annum. Now, we're not being competitive here, but that is something that we definitely need to share more about. And I went back to Jennifer Barth to talk to her about this. Jen, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, thank you, Amanda. I'm Dr. Jennifer Barth, Director of Research at Smooth Media. We're a group of academics and researchers looking at the intersections of emerging technology and socioeconomic impact, producing independent research and reports for thought leadership and for PR. I've been on this journey with Amanda since Phase 1, moving through Phase 2, really proud of what we've created here. And we'll be moving along again to Phase 3 after this, working to make visible the breadth and impact of open source software in the UK.
Thanks, Jen. So surveys are pretty new to me. What makes a good survey?
Well, I work with a fantastic team of economists and researchers and psychologists, and together we create surveys and outputs that move beyond tracking people, what they're thinking, what they're doing, what's happening. And we try to move towards behaviors and the potential for change. So we ask them straightforward questions that can illuminate exactly what's going on out there. What are the state of things? But we also look at actions, attitudes, where a business is at, where a group is at, where people are at, so that we can cross-analyze and understand the movement, the growth, and projecting into the future as well. I think that's what's made this survey really special. We also, add to that by bringing it to life. So we bring those numbers to life through things like the wonderful case studies we've included in our report this year, and speaking with experts in the area so that we can really dig into what this looks like in action.
I'm really pleased to hear that the survey is special. We had 273 respondents and they took part in just under a month. Now, I don't know what to think about that number. Can you provide a bit more colour to it, please?
Sure, we're really happy with that number of respondents. So thank you to everyone who took some time to do that. That was very fast. You know, in a month to get 273 met our basic requirement, which was to get at least 260 to be representative for the UK. And it's also in line with other recent reports, the one coming out of France with about 140 respondents, and even the Linux Foundation, which we talk about in our report, had a much broader response, over 1,000 because it was global, and then a smaller handful of the UK, which we've been able to use to discuss our work. So we're really happy with our 273 respondents.
Okay, so that means that 273 is respectable, right? So Jen, I'm going to ask you 10 questions about the report and let's see how you do. Number one, firstly, we heard from a few of the participants in the survey about their experience with open source software adoption. So who's actually using it amongst those surveyed?
Well, our biggest finding is our sort of overall of the 273 respondents is that 97% use some form of open source software in their businesses. And that includes, of course, languages in that large number. And 89% of those, of that 97%, run open source software in their businesses.
89% of the 97 or 89% of those surveyed?
89% of those surveyed. Thanks very much, Amanda. Run open source software in their business. Now, we looked at that, as I said earlier, across also how a business is doing and what the kind of outlook looks like. And so our big numbers say 64% of the businesses surveyed experienced business growth in 2020 compared to 2019. We need to see this in the context that the largest number of respondents was in the tech sector. And of course, we know they grew even through the pandemic, while others may not. So we see that as business growth. But a really nice complement to that stat is that 48% of businesses surveyed reported an increase in the use of open source software during that same period. So from 2019 to 2020. So we'll break that down and how that use changed, but it's seeing that growth and progression that we found really helpful in this survey.
That's a pretty high set of numbers, some pretty high percentages. Now, I'm obviously not surprised. And I guess it's as Nigel Abbott from GitHub said in the report, most businesses, particularly at the C-suite level, they're using open source software, but not aware of it. So how are they using it? So let's go to question 2 and talk more about what they're using, Jen.
Sure. So across all of the respondents, so everyone included in all of the sectors that we spoke with, that we surveyed, the use of public repositories like GitHub, etc., was very high, 83%, for example. In the technology, media, and telecom sector itself, this jumped to 94%. So you see that difference between the broader sectors. And when I say those sectors, we looked at banking and finance, health and the public sector, education, which we got some great findings on, and professional services, as well as then smaller response came from the charitable sector and manufacturing and retail, for example. So even in banking and finance, 93% use open source operating systems. And in professional consulting and legal services, arguably the biggest sector in the UK, really, 63% use open source software tools of some sort. So there's more breakdown in the report itself, but you can see the kind of way in which this lays out for different businesses and what they're using.
That's interesting, and that's looking across all different use cases. But let's drill down a little bit. Tell me about the cloud.
Yes, of course. So, I mean, what we did here, we looked across the use of cloud infrastructure services. Of course, we see the big ones, AWS, Google, and MS Azure all being very highly used, but also it goes all the way down along with smaller findings around sort of VMware, et cetera, who we spoke to as well for the report. Large companies are seen to have a strong preference for the big groups. Medium-sized companies like VMware is preferred by 10%, for example, IBM by 7%, and then smaller ones around 3%. And in small-sized company, OVH is used by 12%, Digital Open 6%. So for example, we see nice use across a broader range. I think it's really important around cloud infrastructure and its services also to think about Kubernetes. And of course, we spoke with Liz Rice about Kubernetes. and how that community has grown. And, that being part of the public infrastructure of the cloud as well as the private, then we see such high uptake.
Right, and we see there how they're using it, but what does that mean from a sort of business engagement perspective, Jen?
Well, although we said, across everything, 97% of businesses in our sample use a type of open source software, we see that a vast majority of respondents, that's 89%, run open source software internally in their businesses, while approximately 2/3 of respondents, so around 65%, contribute to open source software.
And these businesses, who are they? What do they do?
A bit less than half of the businesses in the survey develop open source software, 49%, and open source their own software, 48%. I mean, a really good example that we have in the report is Anthony Nolan creating Atlas. Sort of have always been minimal users of open source really throughout, but have decided to create a repository that they made completely open. So you see that kind of uptake in developing an open source software, of developing into this space, of contributing back. Small companies are much more involved in open source software production, with 61% saying they have open source their software, while 57% develop open source software. So you can see, and in a country like the UK, where a vast majority are actually small to medium businesses, we see a very high use among those businesses, and a very high, not just use of open source software, but a real interaction with sort of developing and creating their own spaces.
Well done, Jen. We're halfway. So question 6. We heard from some of the participants about the perceived benefits of using open source software. But do we get any idea from the survey why they're using open source software?
Yeah, I really like this question. I think this got some great findings. Overall, if you look at the graph, you'll see we looked at cost savings, collaboration, skill development, quality of the code, the community building as part of it, security, of course, which we'll come to as well, influencing feature development, diversity, and influencing projects otherwise. Now, I've said those in order of how they've come out, but the idea being there's a vast range of business benefits that we see. The primary concern, of course, is savings on costs by the majority of the businesses. That's 75%. Helping businesses use resources more efficiently, of course. And collaboration is the second most popular reason in our sample at 72%. Skills development following that at 64%. But I think this is a really great point to talk about the education sector, where the primary benefit in education is not cost savings, but skill development at 77% among the respondents in the education sector, and followed by collaboration at 73%. And it's a really great finding, because of course we've highlighted the education sector here in our report with our case studies, speaking with the University of Edinburgh, of Swansea, and the Turing Institute, all of which really talk about this culture of open and the need to have these skills in order to even engage in research and where we're going. So sharing, the only way to be part of this is to be in public repositories, to have your work out there, to have your findings out there, to be able to collaborate. And so open source software, of course, forms the basis for a lot of these research intensive ways of thinking. But on top of that, of course, is learning. And so at Swansea, for example, there's such a strong sense of having open in the curriculum, which we hope, and everyone, talks about the need for that to roll down towards, primary and secondary education, and that we start to not just learn more coding, but also what open source brings to us and why that collaboration is beneficial.
That's really interesting, and it's the skills piece, the learning piece is very close to my heart and the hearts of many of the open source people who've joined us with business people today. But from my own perspective, the thing that I probably love best about the work I've done around open source is collaboration. So let's just stay with that for a moment for question 7. Can you elaborate a bit more on the outputs around collaboration, John?
So collaborations and participation in open source projects, we asked sort of what types of groups, who you're collaborating with, how you're collaborating with them. More than half of the businesses in our sample, so 52%, participate in open source community projects of some sort. Of course, we are going to dig deeper into this and the kind of concept of collaboration and how that impacts business use for phase 3. But to say now, that on top of that 54% with open source community projects, everything else was between 20 and 40% of use among our respondents. Organizations answered that they were collaborating with nonprofit organizations and foundations, with academic institutions, which we're seeing really strongly now, with public sector organizations, with other private organizations of the same market size, for example. So finding ways, other private organizations of larger market size. And all of these were within, as I say, that 20 to 40% band. So there's quite a lot of collaboration. And as we saw around the benefits, where collaboration rate high among not just the education sector, but all of the respondents, we see that as a very big piece of what's happening. And that sense that if we can all say, here's a basic thing we can do together and we can collaborate, we can build our competitiveness on top of that. You don't need to hide that. You need to open up, you need to share, and in that way you can all build from there.
So just picking up on that and the collaboration piece, we see companies go on a journey with open source from being a user to actually giving back. Is there anything we can draw out of the data around that contribution?
Well, the bulk of contribution, we did ask, are you contributing back as well as running? Bulk of that contribution comes to the technology, media, and communication sector, where 78% of respondents answer that they contribute. But we broke that down further because that's a very high number, of course. And we found that if you looked at all the non-tech sectors, so all of the other sectors in among our survey respondents, this is actually 53% of contributing. Now that's even still probably a little bit high, but we like it, that's a good number. And I think overall, the issue of contributing is growing. So among some of the people we spoke to, you just found that was still a point that, they were trying to move forward on, but they hadn't quite achieved for some, trying to really move towards that collaboration. Contributing back. And I think in particular among larger companies and often in sort of finance sector, that becomes a bit of a more difficult. In a highly regulated sector, some of these things are more difficult. So trying to move those things forward, but a real sense of the importance of contributing.
Yeah, and I'd like to double back there. I'm not going to double down on open, everybody, don't worry. In joke for those of you in open source, I'm going to double back to skills. Something that I know was picked up a lot, skills and recruitment.
Sure. I mean, we have a really nice, I really quite like this one figure that shows who was hired over the last 12 months and then where that's going over the next 6 to 12 months. And overall, we're seeing a slowdown in hiring for roles related to open source, but we saw a massive uptake in the last 12 months. So we see an expected increase in the use of, for example, open source program offices, which we're going to speak about more, and enhance governance in relation to implementation. So we're also going to see not just the increase in the hiring of back-end developers, full stack developers, DevOps engineers, but also those who can look at and think about these governance issues and creating program offices and managing internal and external creation and contribution among open. So I think it's worth saying that in, for example, the education sector, the most in-demand roles in the next 6 to 12 months that are related to open are project managers, front-end developers, and solution architects. And I like that idea because as a project manager comes in, and we have seen in both our survey and among the people we spoke to, needing to hire that role, project managers who know how to project manage open source, right? This is a new place. And so we see that really building in education, and that really resonates for me. In public care and health and pharma, we see cloud engineers, cloud architects, and enterprise architects as the 3 most in demand over the next 6 to 12 months. And that's quite similar to what we see in something like banking and finance sector.
Okay, and that gives us a pretty clear picture of where we're at today. Now, it's been a pretty tough 18 months, right? For me, for you, for all of us. We've been through this roller coaster, you and I together, from our first call back in January, where in fact you were the person who interviewed me as a subject matter expert. Since then, we've pulled together this evidence in phase 1 about the UK's position as #1 contributor in Europe as a centre of excellence for open source. And now with the survey and the start of the many case studies we're going to be sharing, this phase 2 where we look at usage. Before we talk more about where Smooth Media's work with OpenUK is going for phase 3, because this is question 10, what about our friends and colleagues across the UK? How's business and industry dealing with and being impacted by COVID, by Brexit, and by a potential downturn? What does the survey say about that?
Well, the COVID-19 and Brexit, interestingly, the respondents do not believe this will negatively impact open source use. And of course, if you look at the stats I started with, you know that there is a growth in the use of open source in the last year, so from 2019 to 2020. Then we see that through the pandemic, use has increased. Also, the argument around Brexit, which we spoke a bit about in phase 1, is that, look, it's always been global. Tech jobs in this area, the kinds of roles we play, and open has always been global. So how Brexit impacts that is less potent than trying to move goods or something across borders, for example. We see an increase in the use of open source as expected as a consequence of Brexit by 5% of the respondents, and 12% believe that COVID-19 has led to an increase in the use of open source. So justifying, again, what I was just speaking about. The financial downturn experienced in the UK and where we are now with finance and the economy will increase the use of open source software. I mean, we saw that as an output, of course, when you think about royalties and the way in which open source software can work. You can't necessarily say that has you can decrease your costs immediately, but people are seeing that as a long-term effect of moving to open source. I think as well, the ability to be agile and innovate and all of the flexibility, all the things that we are learning about and being able to do, and why DevOps and engineers and everyone wants to work with open, though that's where we're going to see that change in cost reduction or that change in the way our businesses function, more than it being a one-to-one relationship of license fees versus not, or that kind of thing. We're going to see a changing notion of productivity and creation and agility.
Just seen Jen explain the outputs of phase 2. And some of those outputs are based on survey questions around utilization and OSPOs and processes and procedures around open source software. And what we see in the UK, according to these survey results, now, bear in mind that 48% here are tech companies. We're seeing 58% of companies having processes and procedures around open source, 54% having policies, 18% knowing about Open Chain, and only 3% having implemented it. And I think we see the procedures and policies here again. And what that's showing us is that as we move further down this line and we become more aware of things like security, which is going to be top of the agenda for the next couple of years, along with sustainability, what we have is a need to focus more on governance, good process, on making sure our software and the environments they impact are secure. And I think part of the way we do that in OpenUK as a consequence of this report is taking leadership. Many of you will already know that we are working on a blueprint with a number of partners. We have a workshop on this next week for the dematerialized, decarbonized, circular data center of the future, edge-based, 5G enabled, using the 3 opens. And a blueprint, of course, is something for others to lift and take and to utilize and to expand on. So the intention is that we are the catalyst that creates this blueprint. It's now being called the patchwork kilt. It's a patchwork of existing ideas, existing plans, and existing technologies, which we will stitch together into a kilt for COP26 in Glasgow in November. But it's not for COP26. It's a bit like Puppy. It's not just for Christmas. It's not just for COP26. It's for life. So that we will then shift this over to one of the existing foundations to manage. And this is all directly related to the work we're doing in the report. And we're acknowledging the need for sustainability, the need to tackle climate change in the way we use our technology. Everything we do, every data interaction has an impact, whether it's through a cloud provider or otherwise. It's being processed and transacted in data centers, which are not entirely green, as we all know, and there's a lot of work to be done there, which we want to contribute to. And we do that through collaboration with our global partners. But we see this collaboration now with Open Chain and others. And what we're going to be doing we're acutely aware through our Founders Forum work that we are not retaining enough of the startups, enough of the scale-ups, and not enough of the startups are becoming scale-ups in the UK where they're based on open source, open technologies. So what we're going to be doing from September is we're going to be taking all of this learning from our reports. We're going to be taking the identification of the need for OSPOs, the identification for the need for more training in this space, and we will probably mid-September kick off a 10-week program in this slot, in this 12 noon Future Leaders slot, and it will become a sort of Future Founders Forum, so that we'll mix the Founders Forum and the Future Leaders together, and we will do a 10-week program. It will be live at noon on Fridays, the way these sessions are now, but it will also be taken away and made beautifully slick by our AV guy and shared across startup incubators, scale-up centres across the UK to try and support that learning and that knowledge that UK businesses need, or UK individuals need, to become business founders. And a lot of that is being generated from our learning from the report. We'll also do some short video recordings, just little tools, few minutes long, which will help with license understanding and some of the other issues that we see people having. If you look at our Twitter feed since the report launched, there's a number of questions about licensing, good licensing, bad licensing, good practices. So we're trying to respond to all of that and pull it together. Now, Rob, my next slide is questions. So let's see if anybody's left. I know a couple of people dropped because they've already seen that video. This will go live on, or go onto YouTube rather, not live, but will go onto YouTube and be publicly available. And we'll be doing a lot more to publicise the fact that this 10-week course will start in September. So does anybody have any questions for me about the report or anything else to do with Open UK? Silenced you all. Okay. Rob, can I hand over to you to wrap?
Yeah, thanks so much, Amanda. That was a really great talk, really interesting, and really good to share those insights from the report. I think there's some really interesting stuff in there that I think everyone will take a bit of time to digest them, and I'm sure questions will be coming thick and fast into comments elsewhere.
Absolutely, and they are on Twitter already.
Well, there we go. No, thank you very much. And yeah, so next week we'll be joined by Geordie Mon Companies, who is Product Marketing Director at Weaveworks. And he'll be talking about GitOps, how mature is the declarative revolution. So do go and sign up for that now. The link is on the Open UK events page.
Particularly interesting one, actually, because GitOps is obviously very important in a Git economy, and it's something that Alexis Richardson at Weaveworks actually created. So homegrown, UK created concept that we're going to learn a lot more about next week. So I'll certainly be joining you, Rob. Thanks very much for having me today.
No worries. Thanks, everybody. Cheers. See you on the next talk. Take care. Bye.